My name is Andrews. I am the Hierophant of the Church of Witchcraft. I basically just keep things kind of on the rails so that we keep moving forward and keep attaining our seminal goal of revitalizing witchcraft under a flexible common practice. Primarily, I practice celestial witchcrafts, of which witchcraft has multiple types of modalities, systems, traditions, types, kinds, if you will. So, thank you for everybody who's here tonight and listening in on this in the future or at the present. With that said, tonight we're going to be talking about spells, divination, as well as our witchcraft. Basically, we want to consider how spells work and how divination works individually, how they independently work from one another. So, how spells work, how divination works separately. Also, how they're going to function together. So we're looking at what spells and divination do from the aspect of those two components. And Gwen, make sure you're watching for the guests, please. Thank you. Also, once we have the kind of function of what spells are, what divination is, how they work together, we're also going to be looking at how they shape our practice collectively. And that's probably one of the more complicated components of this. And the first part of that, we're talking about the spells that function individually. We're looking at the source or scope of this, as well as method and your purposes. We're also going to look at the divination separately, and that will include the three I's. We always love our three model. We have the three C's: cleanse, consecrate, charge. And we also now have a new thing for the three I's that will help us understand divination in a more cohesive fashion. Finally, how these things shape our praxis and our witchcraft in general is going to bind together some of our principles within how we understand orthodoxy, how we understand orthopraxy, as well as our daemonology overall. And I'll be providing some examples for that too. So in the first part of this, we're talking about how spells function on their own. There are sermons in the past that you can look at and consider specifically on spellcraft of how we shape all of those, how we are going to bring those to bear, what area, and go way into detail. This is just a very quick and dirty version and very fast iteration. Spells primarily work through either invocation or evocation, or somewhere amidst those two polarities, right? Because I think Kabbalistically, not everybody does. But that relationship of invoke versus an evoke. The other area that spells are going to work on are thaumaturgy and theurgy. And finally, sympathetic magic as well as contagion magic. So these kind of six ideas float around and they're dualities of one another. The polarity they speak of, I mention all the time, has to do with if they're on two opposite sides, but they're not dichotomous, meaning that they aren't just standalone. They're on the same spectrum or the same scale. And so from that scale, we can do a little bit more invoking, a little bit more evoking. Same thing with thaumaturgy, theurgy. It's all talking about some of the same similar principles. In invoking and evoking, essentially invoking, think of it as drawing down. It's something that's coming into us that's going to be working through us, right? So we're channeling essentially the energy, and that's kind of a loose word to use in this because channeling is more to do with mediumship. However, this concept of drawing down, think of drawing down the moon. It's something I talked about with Iamblichus and Plotinus, I believe. Another previous sermon that you can review at your leisure. Basically drawing down is the concept of bringing the celestial, the heavenly, the Aaronic, those kinds of gods on the outer realms into oneself for an effect, right? And that is ancient concept. In current conceptualizations in modernity, you're looking at things where in traditional like Wicca setups, in Wicca, you have the high priestess in the middle, usually the high priestess, high priest in the center, with all the witches around them on the outside that are drawing down and through and channeling into the high priest, high priestess for some effect, right? That's where we're getting the idea of the sacred circle, of why we have the athames and all of that stuff. And so that is part of the invoking of energy. Opposite that is evocation. A really easy understanding of this is basically summonings, right? So I'm going to basically bring something here outside of myself, and I'm going to cast it into the world, into effect in this realm, right? Wherever that might be, whatever realm you're choosing. This is why we talk about witches being in working with the liminal, precisely because of this reason. We're working with liminal states, these in between parts. So you're invoking is that drawing down concept, something that's coming into you, and you're making that change in configuration, and you're evoking is bringing something to a realm to effect a purpose of some kind. In thaumaturgy, we're looking at basically influencing the physical plane. So this thing that we're working in right now, this 3D meat space, right? Thaumaturgy. Broad strokes. There's a lot more to thaumaturgy, but for sake of this discussion. Theurgy is essentially your metaphysical configurations. So I'm working with theurgic aspects. So something extra natural to us, something outside of this plane, something that is potentially non-tangible, right? Thaumaturgy, physical, theurgy, metaphysical, broadly. And then when we talk about our sympathetic magic versus contagion magic, sympathetic magic is essentially, it has to do with imitative magic or correspondence. Something stands in for another, right? So you'll get this in animism, right? I want the strength of of like an elephant, for example. It's imitating the strength of that for an effect. Sympathetic magic. Your contagion magic is a magical connection exists between the target and the object, right? So hair, nail, those kinds of things. Blood is another one that you'll see. A lot of those aspects are going to be what contagion magic has to do. There's a magical link between the target, the person, or whatever it happens to be, and the object that you're working with. The same thing holds true for not just people, but also areas that you're working in. So if you want something that has to do with mountains that has that, you're going to bring something from the mountains and it holds that magical link. That is your contagion magic. It's affecting it itself. Uh, Essentially, we want to elicit a demonstrable change in one or more realms as configured by witchcraft. So spells, this is what it's doing, is that we're using this to elicit a demonstrable or notable change in one or more realms. And that is defined or configured by the witchcraft that we're doing. Next up is divination. We're looking at various approaches. Some of this may include invocation and evocation to augment or supplement the divination that you're doing. Again, this has to do with your scope, your focus, where it's going, that kind of a thing. Uh, Generally, there are three really broad categories that have to do with divination, and that is cartomancy, dowsing, and claromancy. Cartomancy has to do with anything that has to do with card reading. So that's tarot, playing cards, oracle, any of that stuff is all within the realm of cartomancy. Cartomancy. Dowsing has to do with trying to divine some location. Think of pendulum work. Looking for dowsing water as another example. Those are the aspects of dowsing as examples for you to sort of hook into as to what divination category we're talking about. Claromancy has things to do with like casting lots, and that's runes, bones, Ogham, Ogham. That's like the stick magic that druids are using, right, to determine things. The I Ching is all part of that claromancy aspect, those casting lots. There's some way that we can divine this. In those three categories, we get the magical three eyes that I was referencing. The three eyes are interpretive, intuitive, and inductive. So those three again are interpretive, intuitive, and inductive. Of those three, those are the biggest things that we're doing. Each one of those categories, cartomancy, dowsing, as well as claromancy, requires interpretation, intuition, as well as inductive reasoning. Our interpretive has to do with deciphering meaning from objects, symbols, or patterns. So you can see why cartomancy would require interpretation because of the reason that we see patterns and we draw conclusions from those, and that's why it's interpretive. Intuitive, personal intuition, and our psychic abilities to gain insight. That would be in the realm of dowsing, right? We're looking for this intuitive feeling of what it is we're looking for or what we're trying to gain. And then in clairvoyancy, you're using inductive reasoning. It's a systematic or formulaic approach to arrive at a conclusion, right? So there's a system that we're using. So much like runes have a certain system, phone reading has a certain system. Those are all aspects that we're using that have formulaic approaches to them to divine information, to get information externaturally. So in cartomancy, dowsing, and clairvoyancy, you will be using interpretation, intuition, and induction, the three I's. There's a lot of different types of divination. They are mostly captured in these three. And that also, you'll see in candle magic, you'll see this in mirror magic, you'll see this pretty much everywhere. These six kind of aspects. In almost every single piece of witchcraft or really anything that any human is going to be doing, interpretation, intuiting, as well as inductive reasoning are all a part of it. Being familiar with your types of divination are going to help you, the way you divine things, right? I'm not going to be looking for a specific system if I'm using dowsing necessarily. I'm using my intuition, right? If I'm invoking the use of my claircognizant, the things that I have that are clear knowing, those are intuitive and sometimes may include pattern recognition. You can combine these as well. So you can use the geometric formulas that exist within either sigil work or in astrology, and you can overlay those into tarot, right? We're using interpretation, induction, as well as intuition to be able to read this information. In closing, essentially, spells are will manifested, and divination obtains information. So spells are a way to manifest our will, and divination is a way to gain information. And now you kind of understand if you look back at why I was talking about ethics and the scale of understanding ethics. And I can't tell you what those are for you. I can tell you how to judge that for yourself. But if you're manifesting your will, is it ethical to do so? If you're using divination to obtain information, is it ethical to do so? Those are questions you're going to need to ask yourselves. Many magic practitioners, users, exist. Witches do all of the above. The spells, divination, the induction, the interpretation, all of that stuff. They do that, but what sets them apart specifically is that they have self-augmentation and integration, and they also have their liminality, the in-betweenness that all witches have, that they all access to do witchcraft. So that self-augmentation is related to that potency and efficacy. It's about those three definitions that we use to describe what a witch is. Part of that is manifesting your will internally and externally. Part of that is partnering with the liminal to work with that in-between space and also increasing your own potency and efficacy. These are aspects of witches that pretty much all of them do. How they arrive at is a whole other matter. Bet nobody ever knew that this actually opened. Magic is a noetic phenomenon, knowing phenomenon. It's based on gnosis. And it may also be understood, magic may also be understood as a pseudoscience. And these perspectives may alter your understanding of the source of witchcraft, occult technologies. If you think of these in a term of pseudoscience, that they have some sort of biological basis or some sort of measurable component to them, It may change how you understand the source of these things, right? If I, because so I connect to the celestial, and that is planets and that sort of stuff, all the astrological components, and you could bring in, for example, quantum physics to better understand the relationship between these. You could just write this on faith alone. You may use animism and give anthropomorphic, human-like characteristics to the deities or entities that you may be working with. And if it's a noetic phenomenon, it's something that is a combinatory field, something that connects all of it together. That magic is a field that is to be manipulated in some way. It could be noetic and pseudoscience. But these are questions that you can ask yourself. Is divination just two minds connecting together in electrical pathways? Possibly. Is a spell just some neuro-linguistic programming that starts giving us some idea of what we should do and aligning us with that, much like when you say, "Oh, I'm thinking I see white cars everywhere," and suddenly you're seeing white cars all over the place. Is it just that? That's why the source of what this is may vary depending on how you perceive what magic is and how these things function. And now, how do these things function together? Spells are basically articulated will manifestation. I'm stating something and I want it to manifest. And divination is this extranatural info gathering that we're doing. Without ritualization or ceremony. So a lot of witchcraft comes down to ritualism, the sequence of behavior that we're all doing. It often includes ceremony. So can you do spells and divination without ritual and ceremony? The answer is yes. And so it works in both ways. And that's what I'm talking about now is that without ritualization or ceremony, how do these work? If you do divination first by gaining the knowledge and then start doing spellcraft, what you're going to manifest, you're basically discerning by divination, gaining guidance or direction in some manner, and then you are going to then manifest and configure the spells that respond to what that direction is. So if I have direction or guidance in a certain way, a deity, an entity, something along those lines, I then cast a spell based on that knowledge. If I do spells first and then divination, basically I'm building a scaffold with the spells to support the information gathering that I'm doing with divination. So I may enhance that or I may limit that with spells and those kinds of articulated manifestation through will. And then doing the divination from that point. It could be to strengthen your divination. It could go to targeting. It could go to scope. It could go to scale. It depends on what you're doing with it. But essentially, I can do a spell and then a divination. The third option that I have is that I can do spells and divination at the same time. Order I don't care about. You might start with divination and then move into spellcraft. You might do spells first and then into divination. That's going to be an approach up to the individual witch themselves, but it's essentially interoperable spell work as divination is occurring. So we're doing them simultaneously. So I may incorporate divination, some information gathering, with the spell work that I'm doing. So I might start casting and then bring in something to that to gain more insight and then continue with the spell later on. Just as we know that spells can be timed, that may have an aspect, might have a component with this, right? So if I'm timing a spell, and I'm making it on every full moon or every dark moon or whatever time trigger that you have, you may incorporate divination in between that. I may be gaining information as the spell is developing and growing as I'm casting that spell. Spells aren't just a one and done thing in every situation. Think of how Solomonic magic works or ceremonial magic works. I'm going to cast a thing and then I'm bringing in an entity of some kind to get that information from them. Continuing on how these work together, spells and divination. Now let's include them in ritualization and in ceremony. Rituals are basically sequences of behavior with a cue of some kind, right? So it's a sequence of behavior that we're doing. So the full moon rises, we do a thing. SVOD, right? A dark moon occurs, we see it, we do a thing from it, right? It may be a natural cue, it may be a personal cue, something else, right? Some sort of cue, and then causes a sequence of behavior. Ceremonies are the exact same as a as a ritual. However, it adds a temporal component, so a time trigger, a phase change. Easy example, birthdays. That's a ceremony with ritual in it. There's a ceremony that demarcates a time change. I'm going from one age to another age. And then there's things that we do for that ceremony, the rituals within that, blowing out candles, destroying a piñata, inviting our friends over, birthday cake. Those are the ritual components of the overall ceremony. Ceremony is a container for rituals. Rituals can be a container for spells and or divination. All of those can be interlaced and work together, but they're not required to. Spells and or divination can be ritualized, so I can make a sequence of behavior based on some sort of cue that occurs, and then that will cause a spell to be, that will inform me that a spell is going to be occurring. Those cues can look like how we set up things with our altars. So at altars, right, we sometimes use incense or candles, and these are cues, triggers for our behavior that we go, okay, we're in this mindset now. This is why there's a showmanship piece to witchcraft. A lot of it is to get us into this alternate state of mind. And these cues trigger that behavior and help us do that. If I'm just walking around, I'm at Walmart, and I'm like, I'm going to do a spell. I'm not usually cued to do a spell at Walmart, right? I'm in the chapel. I'm cued to do things, right? There are certain cues that help me understand that ritualization and when it's necessary. These are specific, repeatable behaviors that enact the spell and or aid in your divination. So I'm doing things that are repeatable. They're the same sort of things that I do, the same sort of things that I set up every time. When I'm in the chapel and I'm working with my altar, there's specific candles that I'm lighting every single time, and it's the ritualized behavior behind every night that I have prayer that I'm doing down here. And that's part of that. It's specific, repeatable behaviors. This can be things like trance, meditation, incense, candle, location, right? You may be cued by being in a specific location that you're working with that has a magical component to it for you and a way to connect to those spirits. That's a possibility as well. Like when you do things like magic at a specific lake or river or crossroads, those are all cues for ritualized behavior to happen. And that could be, again, spells or divination of some iteration. The behavior sequence in the above, so from all of that behavior sequence, can be incorporated within ceremony. Ceremonies should be some time that we consider the flow of divination, the flow of the spells that are linked to your purpose or your intent. So if I have a specific intent or purpose in mind, then that ceremony and that ritualization piece are going to be derived about that. If I'm doing something emotional, depending on what it is, let's say I want to get in touch with a shadow side of myself, I'm probably going to be incorporating water of some kind. That might require a cue of water. It might be using moon water, might be using a river, something along those lines that initiates that cue for me. And so that flow is going to matter. If I'm doing something that has more to do with some vehemence, some anger, or some potency behind it that I want to exert will with some gusto, shall we say, maybe I need to use fire. That is what drives how your ceremonies and rituals are then devised, because it's about what the intent and the purpose is for that. And these cues help us understand when we're going to do that. So you're starting to see these links between spells and divination. When I know what the cue is, it tells me, should I be doing spells or divination? If my cue is, man, I'm feeling really lost, most of us will turn to divination. That in that of itself is its own cue, right? If you're doing any sort of prayers or invoking or evoking, you may be bringing a deity into that. You may be praying to it. You may be giving some honor to that. And that's important too, because it may be assisting your divination or spell work. Now you're seeing how spells, divination, and your practice are interwoven together. Often ceremonies will also incorporate group work, so you'll see that very frequently. You don't need a group to do ceremony and ritual. It does, in my experience, seem to increase the potency and efficacy overall. I like doing group work, but I also appreciate the rituals and ceremonies that I have that are solitary. And they're just as relevant as anything else. Different experiences, right? We're going to be feeling a certain way that's not going to be the same in either setup. So how do these shape our practice? Briefly, orthodoxy is correct or applied belief. Orthodoxy is the correct or applied belief. Orthopraxy is your correct or supportive practice. And I say supportive because it helps us, because correct means that there's some right, or it suggests a wrong way to do orthopraxy. And that doesn't really jive with the whole Church of Witchcraft thing of being accepting of systems and traditions that are different or have different approaches to them. So your accepted belief that orthodoxy is how you believe things are organized. That may incorporate faith, those kinds of things. Orthopraxy is that supportive practice, the things that support the practice of what you do. And I like those terms a little more. They're a little more approachable. Our term, daemonology, is essentially the cohesive set of knowledge underlying orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Everything that's comprised in your orthodoxy, everything that's comprised in your orthopraxy, those two things together, among other things, but essentially those two things are going to underlie the practice of daemonology. That's what it is. Daemonology is so named for the demonic, or daemon, from wisdom, and that comes from Greek. You can go watch that sermon later. It exists, so you can get a good grip on what daemonology is. But essentially, that is what daemonology stands for. In orthodoxic or doxastic spellcraft, so this is those accepted beliefs of your spellcraft, right? It is your witchcraft system or tradition and the belief it has in spells, how they function, what they do, the correspondences that they have. That is essentially the orthodoxy of your spellcraft. In your witchcraft system or tradition, it is your belief of divination within that system or tradition. How it's accessed, how you invoke it, evoke it, the scope, the scale, all of the stuff that we just talked about, all of that is part of your orthodoxic divination. So both are related to, spellcraft divination is related to how you accept your accepted beliefs and your supportive practices. And I can't define that for you. That is a journey that every witch goes on to do. And that is the daemonology that I'm talking about. In orthopraxic spellcraft, on that side, it is essentially your witchcraft system or traditions, actions, or behaviors that enact your spells. However that is done. In orthopraxic's divination, it is your types or methods of divination. This is where we have to get into some of these examples so that we don't get totally off the rails here. But essentially, think about Norse Sather, right? They sing or they speak their spellcraft. They use a lot of runes in them, for example, during their cleromancy. And so they're going to rely a lot heavier on their inductive three in divination. That's going to be a difference, and that informs their practice. That is their belief, their accepted belief that there's some influence there from their deities, entities, that sort of thing. And it's also their accepted practices, their supportive practices. And so those pieces are what's informing the Norse beliefs, as one example. In celestial witchcraft, portals, thresholds, gateway magics are all part of that. And so that's something that is very endemic to what I do, right? And as I'm working through those, I'm looking for those gateways. I don't know if you can tell this, but there's a white sphere and a black sphere. There's a lot of these portals and gateways that you're going to start seeing now if you watch any number of these videos. And that is very particular to the type of witchcraft that I'm doing. And that is what is informing it. I have specific beliefs about that, about how portals function, and then also how I'm going to practice those things and enact my spells and divination. It's related to that. In the fairy tradition, they're going to be using a lot of contract spells. Their divination is going to work through individual fairies, entities, that kind of a thing that they're going to be aiming for. They're going to have certain deference to them. They're going to pay homage or they're going to venerate them in some way. They are going to have a lot of fey interaction and guidance or hindrance of divination. Fairy magic is going to be very different. It's bringing in certain supplications, right? I'm going to be making offerings. That's going to shape how I act and what I believe in. In British traditional witchcraft, there's a strong link of male and female duality that's going on, where they're blending the two together. Think of Beltane that's coming up, how the male unifies with the female and what that brings about. All of that is a very strong component of that. It has to do with balance, nature focused, orthopraxy overall. They're out there, a lot of times you're going to see practices of being skyclad, no clothes on, that kind of thing, getting closer to nature, becoming into that more animalistic space, sharing that with them. And that's shaping their beliefs, what they believe in specifically, and how they practice. The Welsh have a different kind of magic as well. They do a lot of wayfinding. Animism is part of that. The raven, the toad, the hare, they all stand for different things. And they're looking at more magic channeling. Again, we're seeing examples of how we have an orthodoxy, a specific kind of belief. They're wayfinding in the Welsh for this example, as well as how they interact with their totemic spirits, the raven, the hare, all that stuff. And they're channeling magic through these things. They use the blasting wand, they use the hook wand. These are their beliefs. And this is really tied to regional practice as well as time period. Your region is going to influence this, how you think of this. We can go way down the rabbit hole on this one. In the Greek magic or Greek witchcraft, you're going to see a lot of pantheon kind of deities. I'm going to have some sort of patron or matron deity that I'm making offerings to. Veneration is going to form that witchcraft. And the flow of what those mythos that exists within the Greek legends, those are going to shape a lot of practice. And a lot of what we're going to see across pretty much everything is going to, that has deities or entities, is going to bring some of that into the mix of how and when you practice it a certain way. Much like celestial witchcraft is shaped by the movement of planets. There are certain things I'm going to do at one time of a year that I won't do at another. It shapes my beliefs and it also shapes my practice. So spells and divination are shaped by those aspects. The orthodoxic spellcraft and divination, as well as orthopraxic spellcraft and divination, these two comprise daemonology in an extremely large way. Spell formation, the scope and the scale, the realm configuration that we're doing as witches is all part of what we're doing with spellcraft and is informed by how we believe and how we practice. Divination is extra natural information gathering. However, that is done, whether it's invoking, evoking, whatever type you're using, is going to be about gathering information for self, for others, for situations, whatever it is. That's part of it. Remember our three I's: interpretive, intuitive, and inductive types of divination. The interpretive is how we're understanding symbols and patterns and those kinds of things. Our intuition is how we perceive something to be, as well as our inductive is the reasoning behind a formulaic sort of approach to reading things like runes or bones or wax or any number of different things. Ash is another one you could read as an example, and this is using your inductive reasoning. Operations for spellcraft and divination can be done with and without ritual and ceremony. We basically learn, then cast as one option. So learning, divination, casting, doing spells. You could do casting and then configure your learning, or you could learn and cast at the same time, right? I may supplicate a certain deity, entity, or something along those lines to augment my spellcraft. And I can do those at the same time. I may do timed spells that have a variance in that, where I may cast a spell initially, reach out and check in with my deities, entities, and then figure out where I need to go next. Are there any augmentations that I need to do for the spellcraft that is in current working? That is part of learning and casting simultaneously. For all of you, now that you've heard me kind of iterate on this, I'm going to give us another few minutes here to kind of consider the things that I was just talking about. I want you to basically think about how your beliefs and practice inform your spellcraft and divination. So you're thinking about your beliefs, what you believe in, how you practice, and then how that shapes your spellcraft and divination. I'll give us a few minutes to think on that. One way that this shapes my own practice, so my beliefs about portals and gateways I made a mention towards as well, that really informs how I do things. When there's prominence of certain planets in certain houses at certain times, shapes what I'm going to do, and really dictates a lot of the timing that I do. Some stuff I just straight miss because it's not an auspicious time. So if you ever hear things like auspicious timing, that's part of what's shaping your behaviors around that. Certain divination I won't do, certain divination is more effective. When I'm looking at locations, for example, I use astrology charts to give me an idea of what's going on to orient myself. The access to that has to do with me doing the prayer and the interaction with the celestial during prayer. And that specifically is a reciprocal relationship. The more often that I venerate, the more often that I interact in the celestial plane, basically, the stronger that information and knowledge is going to be as I gain it. And the more efficacious that my spellcraft is going to be. So this really shapes a lot of my own personal practice, but that's not the same for everybody. In celestial witchcraft, though, it does play a large part. And Gwen, did you want to take on the posting that we just got?
Ambrose said, for me, I don't know who is believed in or connected with, so I have at this point mostly focused inward with spellcraft and ritual focus on shadow work or what I want to create and build for myself. I also am still getting used to Oracle cards slash tarot, so I tend to approach it as pulling a card at a time and meditating and focusing on the one as learning. This might not quite answer the question. Um, After participating in this church, I have noticed I am much more aware and more involved in moon cycles and the wheel of the year.
Fantastic points from Ambrose. Not knowing what a practice is, not knowing what harkens to you or what kind of system or tradition you're working with leads to a lot of this internal thing. But one thing that it will bring up that I can easier define is that you're working with magic. Arguably, in more modern parlance, you'll hear energy work, right? You're doing a lot of that. It's your internal stuff, right? This is going to look a lot of beginning people, I think that I may errantly direct towards Thelemic witchcraft or Thelema in general because it's so inwardly focused, much like what you're talking about. But it's essentially magic work at a base core level, working on your own self, incorporating other pieces, deities, entities, timing, moon phases, all of that stuff is a component of this. There may be a specific deity or entity that comes to you for lunar cycles, for example, and that's something you could petition. It is not required. It may never be a thing. You may just be straight nature, and that might just be what it is. And you may just work elementally, and that may not incorporate deities or entities of any kind. Um, but I'm glad that you are aware that the heart of a witch, the hands of a witch, and the eyes of a witch from really early on talks about being observant of your own practice. And that is so crucial to this, that you noticing how you're more aware and more connected to the lunar cycles is part of you being aware. That is part of your practice, is becoming into that space.
We have a response or a message from Michelle. I have always had a connection with nature, even as a small child, and this has always been a huge part of my craft. To the point, all my tarot cards are either nature or animals. I've even started working on a greenhouse to start working directly with nature.
Exactly. It is that very much the same thing. When you work elementally, like I know you do, you're going to be drawn to those things, those elements, those correspondences. You're going to be, a lot of things are open to you, but start to get more focused on how you want to approach. And really, it comes down to the typing of that. So looking at those three eyes, right? If we're looking at something of those, the interpretive, intuitive, or inductive, all of those are going to be applicable, which makes these things really challenging, especially when it's so broad. And this is why systems and traditions are really helpful. It's why I started working on the celestial tradition because of, well, system really different discussion, but essentially I needed a underpinning, an undergirding of what it is that I was doing in my own craft because very similarly, it was just too broad. All of these apply to all witchcraft, but it can be overwhelming in that instance. And I think that some of that overwhelm that newer witches that come to our church experience, not saying that you're a newer witch, but newer witches just in general have this overwhelm because, oh my God, how do I know what I like? What do I do? Try it all. Do stuff. Things will call to you. I often will tell people, consider what stylistic eras you are interested in or regional places. This really falls into like the Greek, Egyptian, African, those, and even European or Germanic or any of those things are all going to kind of, I start looking at that. What things call to you? Because that's going to really give us an idea of kind of where to target, right? If I have African stuff, I'm probably not going to tell you to go hang out and read a whole bunch of Norse sagas. Like that's not going to help you because you have no interest, no connection there. And so that broadness is helped by having a daemonology behind it. Specifically, daemonology, again, is informed by your orthodoxy and your orthopraxy, whereby spells and divination are formed. And that can be wildly overwhelming. So kudos to you for attempting it and doing all the things. Building your demonic knowledge core builds your approach to spells and divination. What is or isn't working for you or does or doesn't work for you. This is why defining witchcraft as one system or tradition is just a fool's errand. Trying to say this is what witchcraft is. I can, however, identify this is what the church is functioning to do. Church of Witchcraft revitalizes witchcraft under a flexible common practice. And the way that is done is by isolating things that all witches seem to do. We're not dictating what your system or tradition is. We're either going to help you find something that you connect with or develop something that is going to work for your type of witchcraft, however you approach it. But knowing how to cleanse and consecrate and charge, that's something that is by nature something pretty much every single witch has ever done that I have ever encountered. Almost every single one of them is going to do divination or spells of some kind. How it's done and whatever is up to the system or tradition. The system may be just a system of you, right? The tradition may be something longer, like you might look at Wiccan, you might look at Chumbly stuff, you might look at any number of different people's approach to this. You may pick up somebody else's tradition that they made for themselves and then run with that, right? How that is formed is going to be helpful to your practice. So defining somebody's like just witchcraft as a broad blanket umbrella thing is not going to help anybody. It does a disservice. Ultimately, witches are going to partner with the liminal. They're going to seek to improve their potency and efficacy. And also, they're going to intentionally manifest internally and externally with some intent. And I had this discussion. I'm just going to bring this in because I have a little bit of extra time. But with potency, I was talking about this, and somebody said, well, isn't that just power? There's a dynamic there that doesn't, there's a power dynamic that comes in with power. There's an externalization of power, meaning I have power over something, that I'm dominating something. Whereas in potency, it's something that is going to be an internal mastery over the self and their own development versus trying to make that so it's an internalization of power, if you will. And this is why we talk about potency and efficacy because we aren't dominating something. We're not designed to do that, I don't think personally. And in the church, there's no dominance over something. If you hear, I always talk about potency or I talk about partnership. I talk about combination. I talk about unity. I talk about those kinds of connections. I'm not looking at how do we control this? How do I control weather? Rather, how do I work with weather? How do I work with nature? How do I incorporate this? How do I respect it? Just like we do with from a multicultural perspective. I don't dominate the culture because I know it. I am utilizing something out of respect and knowledge from that and accepting that I probably don't know enough of it because it's not something that is natively mine, right? Celestial witchcraft is not natively mine. Technically, it's more Sumerian and Mesopotamian. Technically, it's kind of Greekish, but Greek and Roman and that whole thing harkens from Mesopotamia and Sumeria, largely. Knowing those roots, knowing how we partner and how we've shared information, how we've been stewards of that is crucial. The Church of Witchcraft captures the essence of what a witch is or what a witch does by broadening our clarity and definitions. What we believe, how we believe, where it comes from, and the source of that, and partnering with it. Thereby, all systems and traditions are a part of the story of witchcraft. The importance and integral binding of witchcraft demonology cannot be overstated. You need to know your what and why. If you don't know why or what it is you're doing, what is your witchcraft? What is it that you're even doing? You're just going to harm yourself at best, and I guess others at worst. I don't really know. But if you don't know what that underlying belief is, and you don't, because you have to accept, if you're a witch, you accept that you believe in magic. Fundamentally, you're going to have to believe in that at some level, right? But it goes beyond that. And knowing what that is, you need to know why you're doing it and what you're doing instead of just doing whatever. Now, I'm not saying chaos, and you might say, oh, chaos witch, like, yes, absolutely. But they know what and why they're doing what they're doing. They thought about it. There is chaos involved, but there is some sort of machination behind it. An underdeveloped demonology diminishes your witchcraft and ultimately undermines you as a witch if you don't know what you believe in. You don't know what you're practicing, and it's just hodgepodge, and you're just trying whatever. You're working to funnel into some sort of consistent practice. It's not, orthodoxy is not something to shy away from. Orthopraxy isn't something to be shying away from. Some witches do. Many witches really do, and they just go to ritualization and they just do what feels good in the moment. How can we repeat this? How can we honor the deities if we're not, or entities, if we're not doing the same kinds of things? At the very least, even if you're honoring a deity or entity of some kind, there's going to be some sort of libation, some sort of food. Yeah, that might change or whatever, but you're still doing consistently something to venerate, to honor, to appease, right? There's a piece of that. And if you're not doing something consistently, what are you doing? If you're just throwing stuff at a wall to see what fits, that doesn't really help. You start as a new witch without any of this sort of conceptualization of what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. But you might want to question as to the what and the why. And like I said, underdeveloped demonology is going to harm your practice overall. The best outcome, I guess, is that you just spin your wheels and get really nowhere and don't really see any benefits whatsoever and then just wander away from witchcraft, I guess. For me, that doesn't work. How do you grow as a witch without without knowing the demonic, without knowing yourself, without knowing what it is you're targeting, what you're interacting with? Why would you ever, for some reason, randomly do Solomonic magic and be like, you know what? I think I'm going to be a Solomonic magician, and I'm just going to summon a bunch of devils to this plane and just see what happens. This is a more common thing than many people probably realize. Many witches just randomly are like, let's just do this. For example, we had one point in time where a bunch of witches decided, a couple of witches that we had been interacting with, not at the church, this is in my youth, they were just like, you know what, let's just do a blood ritual, just see what happens. I did not participate. That was just silliness, in my opinion. And they participated, and pretty much every one of them has had a really rough go of things for pretty much as long as I've known they've existed. Again, knowing why or what you're doing. It's not just a flippant thing. It's not just a throwaway thing. You're practicing witchcraft. You are practicing witch. You believe in these things, so do the things with reason and purpose behind it, whatever that is, however it's shaped. We all do a disservice to witchcraft by not understanding our own demonology and not adhering to that knowledge and your doctrine that's in there. Doctrine is just the lessons that you're being taught within that system or tradition, whether that's devised by you or devised by a system or tradition, doesn't matter. But we do a disservice if we aren't adhering to these doctrines within our demonology, how we believe and how we practice. We don't have a what and why, then why do you need divination? There's no purpose for it. You just as a party trick, maybe. And yeah, you can throw a dart at a dartboard and hit something, but what value is that if you don't have the scoring system that underlies that, right? So do yourselves a favor, do witchcraft a favor. Do this with earnest practice and intent. Figure out what you believe and why you believe it. And even if you're wrong, this is where you really need to be okay with being wrong. I am good with being wrong. If you think I'm way off my rocker, please have a conversation with me. As long as it's collaborative and respectful, as I will do the same for others. But you need to figure out where you stand, what you're doing in your witchcraft. Because then why it's okay to not know. It's okay to explore and practice and try these things. Talk to people in the church. We've had a lot of experiences, some positive, some negative, some just straight out silly that just aren't appropriate and ended very poorly. And these are experiences that we bring as clergy, as laity, to those that are part of the church, right? And to witches just in general. We're bringing that to them so that they have some fundamental connection that they can draw resources from that I didn't have the benefit for, that many of the witches here did not have the benefit of. But being a part of the Church of Witchcraft gives us that resource that we didn't have. And that's a service that we all do for the laity, for the clergy, for the new witches that haven't found the church yet. That's all part of what we're doing. That is part of our goals in this church.
She said, "This is a great prompt to put in your Book of Shadows or grimoire."
Precisely. Each one of these things, I the sermons are not just a service for the church, for the other witches, to get this knowledge out of my brain and work through this. It's also for me to understand. Demonology came about because I had to figure out a reason of why is this stuff connected. It's not theology. God's not involved for me. That doesn't make sense. And not all witches have a god or goddesses, right? And so it all of these sermons help me develop and clarify in a broad sense what it is that I believe in. And I've certainly been challenged on those. I'm still jury's out on gods and goddesses, for example. I don't know yet. I'm still working through that. And that is part of the curiosity that drives my witchcraft. What am I going to find out there? What am I going to encounter? What happens when I start doing, dream magic? Didn't know, found out, turned out okay. And I can share that with people. I can guide people now because I had that experience, but I didn't have somebody to teach me oneromancy or somniurgy. It didn't exist in a in a certain way. And so nobody could share it with me. I couldn't find a teacher for it. There's various places. Nobody taught me how to do celestial magic. I put that together because I needed to know what my what and why are, because I needed to develop the demonology behind it, to understand my belief, to understand my practice. Spells and divination are widely and deeply shaped by your demonology, and they really shape our craft more than we probably give it credit for. And again, like Michelle said, this is something to put in your Book of Shadows or your grimoire. Figure out what these things are, where you stand, and be comfortable being wrong. And that's okay too. Knowing how to adjust and accept new information is crucial. And critical thinking is criminally overlooked in our society as of today. So do yourself a favor, figure out what it is you're believing and what you're practicing. If you don't know right away, that's fine. Really, only if you get like about three-quarters of the way, that's pretty good, right? You're not going to get this 100%. Nobody's going to get this, and things are going to change in your witchcraft. Your belief, your experiences are going to alter with time, and they're going to solidify into a shape that is your witchcraft. And we want to respect and honor that as much as humanly possible. So work on that. And I'll work on it too with all of you.